They actually bulldozed it. My cabin, gone, utterly, irrevocably obliterated. I'm standing here, right now, where my small, perfectly imperfect A-frame used to nestle amongst the pines, and all I see is churned earth, splinters of wood that used to be my grandfather's hand-hewn beams, and the greasy tracks of some heavy machinery. How did we get to a point where a homeowners association, a collection of busybody neighbors with too much time on their hands, thinks they can just erase someone's property, vanish it from the face of the earth as if it were an offending dandelion? Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Because this story, let me tell you, it's a wild one. It's probably broken some kind of world record for HOA overreach, and it all started, believe it or not, with a deceptively simple, almost neighborly request from the HOA president herself, a woman named Brenda McLaughlin. My cabin wasn't in Aspen or some trendy mountain enclave. It was a legacy, a small, rustic sanctuary on a plot of land my family had owned for 3 generations, long before Lakeside Meadows Community Association even existed as a gleam in a developer's eye. I'd inherited it from my father, who'd inherited it from his. It was my escape hatch, the one place I could truly disconnect from the relentless pressures of my rather public life. I'd bought the adjacent tiny parcel it sat on under my personal name, Mark Stratton, decades ago, keeping its existence deliberately quiet. No motorcade, no security detail. Just me, an old flannel shirt, a well-thumbed book, and the sound of the wind in the trees. The cabin itself was charmingly dilapidated in all the right ways, solid but weathered. It had a stone fireplace that smoked a bit if the wind was wrong, mismatched furniture, and shelves crammed with books that smelled of time and damp wool. Critically, it was situated just outside the clearly demarcated boundaries of the main Lakeside Meadows development, or so I and the county surveyor's maps believed. They'd recently bought up a large, undeveloped tract behind my land, farther from the lake, and that seemed to be where their jurisdictional ambition began to bleed. I first met Brenda McLaughlin at a mandatory, new adjacent property owner orientation, which I found mildly amusing. I'd owned my patch for over 20 years before their precious association was even a blueprint. Brenda was exactly what you'd picture if you typed HOA President Nightmare into an AI image generator. Mid-50s, a razor-sharp, blonde-dyed helmet of hair that looked like it could deflect small arms fire, an expensive but ill-fitting turquoise pantsuit that screamed local daytime TV host, and eyes that seemed to be constantly scanning for infractions. She drove a pristine, gleaming white Range Rover, the kind that never saw a speck of mud, and carried a leather-bound clipboard like a scepter. Her handshake was limp, but her gaze was piercing. She exuded an air of someone who had been put on this earth to ensure everyone else was adhering to her interpretation of rules that mostly benefited her sense of order. "Mr. Stratton," she'd said, her voice a sort of syrupy drawl that didn't quite mask a steely undertone. "Welcome, formally, to the sphere of Lakeside Meadows. We pride ourselves on our community standards." I simply nodded, a mild-mannered new neighbor. The initial interaction was bland enough. She outlined their grand vision for the newly acquired lands: nature trails, a picnic area, maybe even a small dock, provided they could get the permits. I listened patiently, made non-committal noises. My cabin wasn't mentioned directly, and I intended to keep it that way. It was my sanctuary, after all, deliberately low profile. The idea of it becoming a line item on an HOA agenda was anathema. I figured a polite distance was the best policy. Oh, how naive I was. How monumentally, catastrophically naive. The slow, creeping encroachment began subtly. It wasn't long after that initial orientation that Brenda made her first, seemingly innocuous approach. She caught me one Saturday as I was attempting to unblock a gutter filled with pine needles. She glided up, my Range Rover crunching ostentatiously on the gravel of my short drive. "Mr. Stratton," she chirped, "we were thinking, the board and I, that since your lovely little cabin is so picturesque and so close to where we're planning the new community Lakeside access trail, Perhaps you'd be amenable to allowing a small, very tasteful sign for Lakeside Meadows welcomes you to be placed just on the edge of your property. It would really enhance the aesthetic for everyone entering the trails from this side. I considered it a sign. Not ideal, but perhaps a minor concession for neighborhood peace. I'd have to see the design, Brenda, and the exact proposed placement, I said carefully. And I'd need to ensure it doesn't impede my access or imply my property is public. She beamed, a shark-like smile that didn't reach her eyes. Of course, just a preliminary thought. We're all about community enhancement. That word, community, was her battering ram. 2 weeks later, the proposal arrived. It wasn't for a sign. It was a sketch of my cabin with a little arrow pointing to it labeled, Future Lakeside Meadows, Guest Annex, Hospitality Suite. My blood pressure, usually quite well managed, gave a distinct throb. Attached was a note, in Brenda's looping, overly ornate handwriting. Dear Mr. Stratton, after further deliberation, the board feels your charming cabin would be an ideal resource for visiting guests of HOA members, potential new buyers, or even for overflow when our, still hypothetical, community center is booked for events. It's just sitting there most of the time, isn't it? It would be such a wonderful gesture of community spirit if you'd allow us to manage a schedule for its use. Think of the goodwill, Mark. We're all a team here at Lakeside Meadows. I reread it, a sense of profound disbelief washing over me. They wanted to use my private home as a free motel, my sanctuary. The sheer, unadulterated gall was breathtaking. I immediately drafted a polite but unequivocal letter. Dear Mrs. McLaughlin, thank you for your creative proposal. However, my cabin is private property, used regularly by myself and my family, and is not available for public or community use. I trust this clarifies my position. I sent it via registered mail. Her reply, a week later, was chillingly sweet. Oh, Mark, perhaps you misunderstood. This wouldn't be public use per se. It would be for vetted HOA guests. And really, it's such a beautiful place. It seems a shame not to share its benefits. We could even discuss a small stipend for your cleaning efforts between guests, though of course, most of our community members pitch in voluntarily for the greater good. Just something to consider. We're a community that values cooperation. The veiled threat, the condescending assumption of my financial need or my desire to become their unpaid innkeeper was not lost on me. This wasn't about a sign anymore. This was about annexation, plain and simple. The battle lines, I sensed, were being drawn, whether I liked it or not. The quiet enjoyment of my rustic retreat was officially under siege. The polite refusal was, it turned out, merely the appetizer for Brenda McLaughlin. The main course of her entitlement was yet to be served. Almost immediately after I sent my letter politely declining her offer to turn my private cabin into a timeshare for the HOA elite, the frivolous violation notices started appearing, tucked under the rustic, slightly crooked mailbox I deliberately left ungentrified. 1 week, it was for unapproved indigenous plant species, which were, in fact, wildflowers that had been growing on that land since before Brenda's great-grandparents were born. The next, it was a demand to repaint the cabin, a community-approved earth tone, despite the fact its weathered gray cedar planks were part of its charm and, again, predated their entire color palette. They even cited me for an unauthorized avian feeding station, which was a single, handcrafted birdhouse my daughter had made me for Father's Day. I responded to each notice formally, calmly, with dated photographs and excerpts from my property survey clearly showing my boundaries and referencing the county's grandfathering clauses for existing structures. I pointed out, repeatedly, the highly dubious nature of their authority, or lack thereof, over my specific, independently owned parcel. My responses were lawyerly, precise, and utterly ignored, save for escalating the pettiness. The subtext was clear. Cooperate with our grand cabin-sharing scheme, Mr. Stratton, or face death by 1,000 paper cuts. Each notice from them felt like another turn of the screw, designed to wear me down, to make maintaining my little patch of solace an administrative nightmare. Then came the email that nearly made me spit out my morning coffee. Attached to a missive titled Proposed Lakeside Meadows Guest Hospitality Roster, Service Expectations Stratton Cabin, was an actual spreadsheet. It listed dates, anonymous guest party sizes, ranging from 2 to family of 5, and then a column that truly showcased Brenda's spectacular audacity. Host services expected. This included, and I am not making this up, daily light housekeeping, linens, tidying, stocked pantry with local artisanal breakfast items, list to be provided by guests, and my personal favorite, optional, 2 evenings per week, simple home-cooked meal for guests, local cuisine preferred, reimbursement for ingredients negotiable up to $15 per head. There was even a suggestion that I provide a curated list of local walking trails and points of interest. They had, in essence, scheduled paying guests, though the payment seemed to be theoretical and not directed at me, into my home and assigned me the role of unpaid concierge, cleaner, and short-order cook. It was as if my previous polite refusal simply hadn't registered in Brenda's reality. This wasn't just a request. It was an imperial decree from Queen Brenda of Lakeside Meadows. My incredulity was rapidly morphing into a cold, simmering anger. These people weren't just entitled. They were operating in a different dimension of social contract. The phrase, "Come on, you have this beautiful place in the woods. Why would you refuse to do us a favor?" was actually in the covering email, as if the sheer existence of my property obligated me to servitude. I heard through the grapevine a nervous, elderly neighbor named Arthur who occasionally shared a whispered word over the dilapidated fence separating my plot from the start of the main development, that Brenda had brought up my uncooperative and frankly selfish attitude at the last HOA board meeting. According to Arthur, she'd painted me as a recalcitrant hermit, obstructing community progress and refusing to integrate with the Lakeside Meadows spirit. He said Brenda had huffed about my refusal to share a clearly underutilized asset and how it reflected poorly on the overall desirability of their burgeoning enclave. Arthur, bless his timid heart, had tried to murmur something about private property rights, but had been promptly steamrollered by Brenda's confident assertions that all properties benefiting from proximity to Lakeside Meadows amenities are subject to community expectations. This was a new, alarming doctrine she seemed to be inventing on the fly. It was at this point I realized that simply swatting away violation notices wasn't going to be enough. This wasn't about weeds or paint colors anymore. This was a concerted campaign, and Brenda was its relentless general. So, I began my own quiet, methodical investigation. I started with the Lakeside Meadows Community Association itself. Pulling their incorporation documents from the Secretary of State's office was simple enough. I read their bylaws, every tedious page. I cross-referenced their declared boundaries with the official county plat maps and my own certified survey. And there it was, clear as day. My parcel, Lot 7B of the old Henderson survey, was explicitly, unequivocally outside their defined territory. They had no legal standing. None. The adjacent properties benefiting clause Arthur had mentioned was vaguely worded wishful thinking on their part, legally unenforceable without a specific covenant, which I had never signed. I then delved into Brenda McLaughlin herself. A little discreet digging revealed she was a former timeshare saleswoman with a rather checkered history of overly aggressive tactics and a string of disgruntled former clients. Her husband, a silent, nervous man named Gary, was a low-level functionary in the county planning office, a connection Brenda likely exploited, or at least implied she could, to intimidate residents. She'd run for HOA president on a platform of enhancing property values through rigorous enforcement, and had systematically pushed out anyone on the board who questioned her methods. This information, gathered over a few late nights, using resources available to any determined citizen, though perhaps my access was a tad more streamlined, painted a picture of a woman intoxicated by minor power, wielding her HOA gavel like a tyrannical monarch. The ultimatum arrived, as I somehow knew it would, on crisp, heavy bond paper embossed with the Lakeside Meadows logo, an offensively twee depiction of a smiling cartoon beaver next to a geometrically perfect lake. Final notice: compliance required. It declared in a stern, pseudo-legal font. It stated that my property, the Stratton Cabin, had been deemed non-compliant with overarching community aesthetic and utility standards, and that my continued refusal to allow access for necessary OA-managed upkeep and guest preparation constituted a breach of unspecified community covenants. Therefore, it continued, Lakeside Meadows Community Association will be undertaking necessary measures to rectify this situation and ensure the property is brought into alignment with community expectations, commencing on or after a date 2 weeks hence. This will include site clearing and preparation for approved community asset utilization if unimpeded access for less drastic measures is not granted. Site clearing. The words hung in the air, cold and brutal. They were threatening to destroy my cabin. My response this time was even more formal. I reiterated my property rights, attached copies of the relevant sections of the county plat map, highlighting my land's exclusion from their HOA, and stated unequivocally that any unauthorized entry onto my property would be considered criminal trespass, and any damage would result in immediate legal action, both civil and criminal. I explicitly warned them against any site clearing. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, and also hand-delivered a copy to the address listed for their management company, getting a signature. I even CC'd Gary McLaughlin at his county office, just to ensure the message was impossible to ignore. I genuinely hoped, even then, that this display of resolute legality would make them see sense that the sheer madness of their threats would evaporate under the cold light of actual law. I underestimated the intoxicating power of Brenda's delusions of grandeur. The date on her ultimatum loomed. I decided a quiet, unannounced visit to the cabin, a few days before their threatened day was in order, just to ensure my no trespassing signs were still prominently displayed. The premonition I had was of vague unease, not the sickening lurch of horror that was about to hit me. The drive up to the cabin was usually a slow decompression for me. The city would recede in my rearview mirror, replaced by thickening forests and winding country roads. But that particular Tuesday morning, a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach with every mile. Their deadline wasn't for another 3 days, but Brenda's final notice had been so aggressive, so unhinged, that a part of me feared she might jump the gun. Emboldened by her own self-righteous conviction, I parked my unassuming sedan where I always did, tucked away behind a stand of mature hemlocks, and walked the familiar short path. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and then I rounded the last bend, and the world simply tilted. Where my cabin should have been, my grandfather's legacy, my quiet refuge, there was nothing but a gaping wound in the earth, raw, reddish-brown soil, scarred by deep, brutal tracks. Splintered wood, shards of glass, the pathetic, twisted remains of my old porch swing. The stone chimney, the one that smoked a bit, was a jagged pile of rubble. It was gone. They had actually done it. They had bulldozed my cabin. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind struggled to process the visual information. It was like a scene from a nightmare, a senseless, violent erasure. The smell hit me then. Diesel fuel, freshly turned dirt, and the faint, ghostly scent of the old wood, now brutalized. Grief, sharp and unexpected, punched me in the gut. This wasn't just timber and nails. It was memories. It was peace. It was a connection to my family, all pulverized under the treads of some indifferent machine. Then, through the shock, a different emotion began to rise, cold and hard as Arctic ice. Fury. A focused, absolute rage unlike anything I had experienced in years. I walked numbly through the debris, my old fishing creel, crushed. A warped vinyl record, one of my father's favorites, sticking out of the mud. A child's drawing, my daughter's, faded but recognizable, now torn and dirt-stained. Each fragment was a separate stab. I immediately took out my phone, my hands shaking almost too much to operate it, and started documenting everything. Hundreds of photos, videos, narrated in a low, trembling voice, noting the date, the time, the utter desolation. The wide, distinct tracks of a bulldozer were unmistakable. They hadn't even tried to be subtle. I walked to the edge of what used to be my property line, near Arthur's fence. He was out, ostensibly inspecting his roses, his face a mask of distress. He scurried over, his voice a shaky whisper. "Mr. Stratton, I saw it. Yesterday. A big yellow machine. Had a Lakeside Meadows approved contractor sign on it. Brenda herself was here, pointing, directing them. I asked one of the workmen. He said it was an emergency demolition of a derelict structure posing an immediate safety hazard." "Derelict? Your cabin was beautiful." He looked terrified, as if expecting Brenda to materialize from the bushes. "Did you get any pictures, Arthur?" I asked, my voice surprisingly level. He shook his head miserably. "Too scared, Mr. Stratton." She looked fierce. I thanked him, told him to stay safe, and then I made the call. My finger hovered over Brenda McLaughlin's number. I took a deep, steadying breath. When she answered, her voice was predictably smug. "Brenda McLaughlin speaking. Lakeside Meadows, HOA. "Brenda," I said, keeping my tone glacial, "it's Mark Stratton. I'm at my cabin. Or, rather, I'm at the pile of rubble where my cabin used to be. Perhaps you can explain this." There was a slight pause, then an audible smirk in her voice. "Oh, Mr. Stratton. Yes, well, finally. We had to take decisive action. Your structure was, frankly, becoming an eyesore and was in clear violation of multiple community standards we'd repeatedly informed you of. And given your refusal to cooperate with its proper upkeep for essential community use, the board authorized its removal. We followed all necessary HOA protocols." Her arrogance was stupefying. "Protocol, Brenda?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "What protocol allows for the unpermitted criminal destruction of private property?" She scoffed. "Don't be so dramatic, Mr. Stratton. It was a dilapidated shack. The space can now be properly landscaped and utilized for the benefit of the entire community. In fact, we're already drawing up plans for a lovely new picnic pavilion. You should be thanking us. It's a marked improvement." A marked improvement. She thought this was an improvement. That was the moment something inside me irrevocably snapped. The patient, reasonable Mark Stratton who wrote polite letters and documented bylaws ceased to exist. "Brenda," I said, my voice utterly devoid of any warmth, any emotion, save for a terrible, cold certainty. "You have just made a monumental mistake. A mistake of such colossal proportions that you cannot possibly comprehend its scale. But you will." I ended the call. My next call was to Sarah Jenkins, my chief of staff. Not as Mark Stratton, distraught cabin owner, but as Governor Mark Stratton, head of the executive branch of this state. "Sarah," I said, my voice transformed. It was the voice I used when demanding action, the one that made seasoned legislators sit up straight. "I need you to initiate a full, top-priority, multi-agency inquiry into an entity known as the Lakeside Meadows Community Association, corporate ID." I read it from my notes. "I want their complete corporate filings, minutes, financials going back to inception. I want every permit, or lack thereof, associated with any activity on or adjacent to parcel, Lot 7B of the Henderson Survey in North Creek County. I need the county sheriff and the district attorney for North Creek County contacted immediately. This is a criminal destruction of property case, potentially with elements of fraud and conspiracy. And Sarah, find me the absolute best, most ruthless prosecutor in the Attorney General's office who specializes in complex land use litigation and dismantling corrupt nonprofits. Someone who eats HOAs like Brenda McLaughlin for breakfast. This needs to move with speed and precision." There was a stunned silence on the other end. Sarah was used to urgent requests, but the chilling fury in my voice was rare. "Governor, is this personal?" she finally asked, her voice cautious. "It has become," I replied, "an official matter of public integrity and the rule of law, Sarah. However, for the next 48 hours, my name, as governor, is to be kept completely out of the initial direct inquiries. I want their raw, unvarnished reactions when the sheriff and the DA's office come knocking, not some panicked, obsequious backpedaling, because they suddenly discover who they've targeted. Let them believe they're dealing with an ordinary citizen they can bully. Their unawareness will be illuminating." Sarah, a consummate professional, just said, "Consider it done, Governor. I'll have a preliminary team assembled within the hour." The switch had been flipped. The storm was gathering, and Brenda McLaughlin, in her pristine Range Rover, was about to drive straight into the eye of a hurricane she couldn't even see. The game had changed drastically. And I, Governor Mark Stratton, was now playing to win, with the full resources of the state of, let's call it, Calderson behind me. The official storm I'd unleashed broke over Lakeside Meadows with astonishing speed and intensity, exactly as planned. Within 24 hours of my call to Sarah, 2 stern-faced North Creek County Sheriff's deputies were on Brenda McLaughlin's manicured doorstep. I was later privy to the Bodycam footage, and it was a masterclass in condescending dismissal met with implacable officialdom. Brenda, clad in a powder-pink tracksuit that did her no favors, tried to wave a sheaf of internal HOA memos at them, claiming full authority and community mandate for the removal of a hazardous structure. She actually told Deputy Miller, a man built like a small oak tree with a gaze that could curdle milk, that he was trespassing on HOA common property by even being on her porch without an appointment. Deputy Miller, to his credit, simply informed her, very calmly, that they were investigating a felony criminal complaint for unlawful destruction of private property valued in excess of $50,000, and that her HOA memos were at that moment irrelevant to his investigation. He then formally requested all documentation related to the demolition order, the contractor used, and the supposed emergency board vote she'd alluded to. Her face, I observed with grim satisfaction, lost a little of its smug certainty. Simultaneously, the North Creek County District Attorney's Office dispatched a subpoena duces tecum to the registered address of the Lakeside Meadows Community Association, demanding all board meeting minutes for the past 2 years, all financial records related to property management and contractor payments, and any and all correspondence, internal or external, pertaining to Lot 7B, Henderson Survey, my ruined cabin. The state-level machinery was also grinding into action. The Department of Corporations, under the Secretary of State's office, initiated a formal inquiry into Lakeside Meadows' charter compliance, operational legitimacy, and financial transparency, citing multiple credible allegations of governance, irregularities, and potential ultra-vires actions. This wasn't some slap on the wrist. This was the kind of investigation that could lead to the involuntary dissolution of the entire HOA if serious misconduct was found. They requested 5 years of audited financials, which I suspected didn't exist in any legitimate form, member lists, complaint logs, and records of all capital expenditures. Brenda, I heard through my discreet channels, was starting to feel the heat, but her arrogance was a remarkably durable substance. She actually tried to call Mr. Stratton again, leaving a rambling, indignant voicemail on the burner phone I'd used for cabin-related matters. She accused me of sicking the county on her over a minor property dispute, and offered, in a tone that suggested immense magnanimity, to discuss a modest compensation for the salvaged lumber, provided I ceased my vexacious complaints. She still thought she was dealing with some lone, disgruntled homeowner she could eventually strong-arm or buy off. She had absolutely no clue that the vexatious complaints were now originating from the highest levels of state government. My instruction to Sarah to keep my name shielded for the initial phase was paying dividends. Brenda's reactions were pure, unadulterated hubris, untempered by any fear of genuine consequences. The investigation began to unearth the rot with horrifying efficiency. The bulldozer company owner, a previously swaggering local contractor named Big Tony Moretti, cracked like a cheap walnut under questioning from a seasoned DA's investigator. Faced with the prospect of losing his business license and potential charges as an accessory to felony destruction, Big Tony produced a work order, signed by Brenda McLaughlin, authorizing the demolition of the abandoned structure at Lot 7B. Crucially, it included a handwritten addendum from Brenda. All necessary permits and notifications handled by LMCA. Proceed with expediency. Except, as county records definitively proved, no demolition permits had ever been applied for, let alone issued. Violation number 1, a big one. Then, the forensic accountant, Sarah, had sourced from the state auditor's office quiet, unassuming individuals who could find financial needles in fiscal haystacks. Descended upon the boxes of haphazardly kept HOA records seized under subpoena. What they found was a cesspool. A slush fund, creatively named Community Enhancement Contingency Fund, personally controlled by Brenda, into which various vaguely justified fees were diverted. The payment to Big Tony's bulldozing bonanza, his actual company name, I kid you not, had come from this fund, disguised as Emergency Site Remediation. They also found receipts for Brenda's frequent shopping trips to high-end boutiques, payments for her Range Rover's detailing service, and even several large consulting fees paid to a shell company that traced back to Gary McLaughlin, her timid husband. Embezzlement. Clear as a Lakeside Meadows, non-existent Crystal Spring. While this was unfolding, the State Environmental Protection Division, alerted by the unpermitted demolition, began looking into potential violations related to debris disposal and disturbance of land near a waterway. Since my property sloped gently towards the actual lake, the list of Brenda's transgressions was growing by the hour. They found forged minutes for an emergency board meeting authorizing the demolition, a meeting that, according to two now very nervous board members who were quickly seeking immunity deals, never actually happened. As whispers of the sweeping investigation began to permeate the manicured cul-de-sacs of Lakeside Meadows, delivered via official-looking envelopes, and the sudden appearance of grim-faced individuals asking pointed questions, a fascinating thing happened. Other residents, people who had been cowed into silence by Brenda's reign of terror for years, began to emerge from the woodwork. Mrs. Henderson, a retired schoolteacher whose prize-winning rose bushes had been arbitrarily deemed non-compliant shrubbery and threatened with removal, provided investigators with a folder full of Brenda's bullying letters. Young Timmy Carmichael's parents shared how Brenda had fined them repeatedly for excessive noise when their son, who had autism, had occasional loud meltdowns. A former board treasurer, a mild-mannered accountant named Stanley Fisk, whom Brenda had systematically discredited and forced out after he'd started asking awkward questions about the enhancement fund, contacted the AG's office directly. He arrived with his own meticulously kept shadow ledger, detailing financial discrepancies he'd suspected for years. He became a star witness. Brenda, sensing her carefully constructed kingdom was crumbling, tried to rally her remaining loyalists. She called an emergency Lakeside Meadows community update meeting in the undersized, stuffy rented hall they used as a temporary community center. According to my sources, Arthur had suddenly found his courage and was now providing surprisingly detailed reports. Brenda delivered a rambling, incoherent speech about external agitators, government overreach targeting successful communities, and certain individuals with personal vendettas trying to undermine our shared values. She never once mentioned the bulldozed cabin or Mark Stratton by name. She spoke of protecting our lifestyle and standing firm against bureaucratic bullies. The irony was so thick you could have paved a driveway with it. The trap, meticulously set, was tightening. Brenda McLaughlin, still flailing with the indignant fury of a petty tyrant, was blissfully unaware she was about to be publicly, officially, and spectacularly checkmated. The state, in its full, methodical might, was closing in, all because she couldn't resist the allure of an empty cabin and the exercise of absolute, albeit tiny, power. The culmination of weeks of intense, behind-the-scenes work by a small army of state investigators, prosecutors, and auditors was scheduled for a specially convened community meeting at the North Creek County Civic Auditorium, a venue chosen for its neutrality and its capacity to hold all interested Lakeside Meadows residents, plus a sizable contingent of local media who had been tipped off about a significant development in a major HOA misconduct case. Brenda McLaughlin, naturally, had initially tried to have the meeting moved to her turf, the cramped HOA rental hall, citing community coherence, but the DA's office had politely, yet firmly, insisted. The atmosphere inside the auditorium was thick with anticipation and a kind of nervous dread. Brenda and her few remaining staunch allies on the board, including her pale, perpetually sweating husband, Gary, sat at a table at the front, attempting an air of beleaguered dignity. They looked less like community leaders and more like defendants awaiting sentencing. The majority of the residents filled the seats, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anxiety, and for some, a dawning, hopeful anger. I was there too, seated discreetly towards the back, in a simple dark suit. For now, I was still just Mark Stratton, cabin owner. Only Sarah Jenkins, seated a few rows ahead, and the lead prosecutor from the Attorney General's office, a formidable woman named Eleanor Vances, knew my other identity. Ms. Vance, radiating an aura of calm, no-nonsense authority, stepped to the podium. She began by outlining the scope of the multi-agency investigation. Then, methodically, piece by damning piece, she laid bare the truth about Lakeside Meadows under Brenda McLaughlin's stewardship. She detailed the illegal, unpermitted demolition of a private dwelling, complete with large projections of Big Tony's work order signed by Brenda and the county surveyor maps showing my property clearly outside HOA jurisdiction. She presented evidence of forged board meeting minutes, manufactured safety reports used as pretext, and witness testimony from the terrified bulldozer operator. Then, she moved to the financials. Enlarged spreadsheets appeared on the screen behind her, tracing the flow of HOA funds into Brenda's personal Community Enhancement Contingency Fund, and then out again for the demolition, for designer clothes, for the Range Rover, for those hefty consulting fees to Gary's shell company. The gasps from the audience were audible. Ms. Vance detailed counts of felony destruction of property, multiple instances of wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement of community funds, and abuse of corporate authority. The sheer scale of the malfeasance was stunning, even to me, and I'd instigated the damn thing. Brenda, throughout Ms. Vance's presentation, squirmed. She whispered furiously to her lawyer, a flustered-looking man who seemed to be shrinking in his chair. Several times she tried to stand and interrupt, shouting things like, "This is a travesty, lies and distortions." But Ms. Vance, with a voice like polished steel, simply said, "You will have your opportunity to respond in a court of law, Mrs. McLaughlin," and continued her devastating exposé. Then came the moment. Ms. Vance paused, looked directly at Brenda, and said, "Mrs. McLaughlin, your actions, particularly the brazen destruction of a private citizen's home, demonstrate a profound contempt for the law and for the rights of others. You leveraged your position for personal vendetta and personal gain, assuming your victim was powerless to resist." Brenda, now on her feet, her face puce, shrieked, "He was uncooperative. That cabin was an eyesore. It was dragging down our property values. I acted in the best interests of this community. This is persecution orchestrated by one bitter, insignificant man." That was my cue. As if on a prearranged signal, I stood up from my seat in the back and began to walk slowly, deliberately, down the center aisle towards the front. A ripple of murmuring went through the crowd. A few people recognized me from newspaper photos or televised addresses, but the connection wasn't immediate for most. Brenda stared, her jaw slackening slightly, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Was it dawning recognition? Disbelief? Ms. Brispeda. Vance waited until I reached the open space before the stage. "Mrs. McLaughlin," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium. "The insignificant man whose home you so cavalierly bulldozed, the man whose character you have attempted to assassinate, is someone who has taken a solemn oath to uphold the laws of this state, laws you have so flagrantly violated. Ladies and gentlemen of Lakeside Meadows, I believe many of you know the owner of the former Stratton cabin. Allow me to reintroduce him, Governor Mark Stratton." The silence that followed was absolute, a deafening void of pure, unadulterated shock. You could have heard a pine needle drop on plush carpet. Brenda McLaughlin's face, already flushed, went a ghastly, mottled white. Her mouth opened and closed like a beached fish. Gary looked like he might actually faint. The carefully constructed facade of HOA President Brenda, Queen of Lakeside Meadows, shattered into a million pieces, live and in color, for all her subjects to witness. I stepped forward, taking the microphone Miss Vance offered. My voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of my office, and more importantly, the deep, personal wound of what had been done. "Good evening," I began, my eyes sweeping across the stunned faces, finally resting on Brenda. For many years, a small cabin in these woods was my family's sanctuary. A place of peace, of memory, of quiet refuge from a very public life. It was mine. It was private. And it was systematically targeted, harassed, and ultimately destroyed by the leadership of this homeowners association, under the false pretense of community standards, and fueled by an astonishing degree of personal arrogance and unchecked power. I paused, letting that sink in. "An OA," I continued, my voice hardening, "is meant to serve its members, to protect and enhance shared value through fair, transparent, and legal means. It is not, and never should be, a petty fiefdom for individuals to exercise personal vendettas, enrich themselves, or ride roughshod over the fundamental property rights of others. What Mrs. McLaughlin and her accomplices did to my property was a criminal act. What they did to your trust, to your community funds, and to the reputation of Lakeside Meadows was a profound betrayal." I saw tears in the eyes of Mrs. Henderson, the Rose Lady. Young Timmy Carmichael's parents were holding hands, a look of vindicated relief on their faces. Even Arthur was sitting straighter, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. The reckoning was swift. As I finished speaking, uniformed officers, who had been discreetly positioned at the exits, moved forward. Brenda McLaughlin, her husband Gary, and 2 other board members who had been deeply complicit in the financial fraud and the demolition cover-up were formally arrested, charged with a raft of felonies. Brenda didn't go quietly. She shrieked about conspiracies and political persecution until she was gently but firmly escorted out, her turquoise pantsuit now looking utterly pathetic. In the aftermath, the Lakeside Meadows Community Association was placed into temporary state receivership. The AG's office, with my full support, spearheaded a complete overhaul. New elections were held under strict supervision, new transparent bylaws drafted, and every penny of the misappropriated funds was meticulously clawed back from Brenda and Gary's assets, which were considerable thanks to their years of silent plunder. They both eventually pleaded guilty to lesser charges to avoid a lengthy, high-profile trial they knew they would lose, but they still served prison time. My cabin? I sued, of course. Not for exorbitant punitive damages, but for the full, meticulously documented cost of rebuilding an exact replica, down to the slightly smoky fireplace, plus a modest sum for emotional distress and the loss of irreplaceable sentimental items. I won, easily. The money came from Brenda's seized assets and the HOA's newly solvent and insured coffers. More broadly, the Lakeside Meadows scandal, as the press dubbed it, became a catalyst. It highlighted the often unchecked power of HOAs and the vulnerability of homeowners. I didn't just rebuild my cabin. I tasked my legislative affairs team with drafting the Homeowner Bill of Rights Act, a comprehensive piece of legislation strengthening homeowner protections, mandating financial transparency for HOAs, and establishing clear mechanisms for accountability and dispute resolution. it passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. My little A-frame, born of family legacy and victim of outrageous hubris, became a symbol of that reform. I did rebuild it, exactly as it was, every beam, every mismatched chair. And yes, occasionally now, local scout troops or school nature clubs use the grounds by the lake for educational outings, by my personal invitation, under my specific guidelines. It shows what true, respectful community engagement can look like, a far cry from Brenda's demands for servitude. So, that's how a seemingly small dispute over access to a rustic cabin in the woods, after it was audaciously bulldozed, led to the downfall of a petty tyrant, the reform of a corrupt HOA, and ultimately, stronger legal protections for homeowners across the entire state. Never underestimate where a fight for what's right might lead you, or the lengths some people will go to when they think they can get away with it. Drop a comment, let me know what you think of Brenda's audacity, and if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare, though hopefully not one involving heavy machinery and a governor. Thanks for listening.